My one-sentence summary of Shadow of the Erdtree is that it's Elden Ring with the dial turned up to 11. But before you excitedly fumble with your mouse and keyboard in your rush to buy the surprisingly expensive entry ticket to this expansion, consider that that might not necessarily be an entirely good thing. Returning to this game after 2 years away from it, most things are more or less as I remember them. The good parts, that is, the discovery and exploration of self-contained indoor areas, are still good, and are easily the highlights of this new edition. The bad parts, the barren open world, the overly punishing boss design, and the insulting repetition of the same bosses and enemies all over the map, are still bad, and perhaps even worse in this expansion than in the base game. The fact that this surprisingly expensive DLC contained a large number of bosses and enemies copied over from the base game was a tough pill to swallow. Even counting generously, I think it's safe to say that a lot less than 50% of encounters will be new to the player, and it largely falls to the interior level design to provide original experiences. Which thankfully it mostly does when it's not just sending you down a ladder to a poison pool for the 300th time. But I mean, look, if you liked Elden Ring, then you can't really go wrong with this expansion. Surprisingly expensive as it is, yes, I am saying this 3 times to make a point. And in all likelihood, if you're watching this, then you've already played it. I made a video about the base game back when it was new, and you might want to check that out before watching the rest of this video if you want more context. But equally, if you're just here to leave a comment telling me to get good, then I can't stop you. Go get 'em, champ. Either way, I'll try not to repeat too many of my thoughts from 2 years ago, but Shadow of the Erdtree is fundamentally more of the same, and shares a lot of the problems I had with the base game. And yet, while this DLC by necessity has to conform to the same overdone formula FromSoft has been cashing in on for over a decade now, there's an unmistakable glimmer of originality in some of the ideas that it brings to the table. Enough to be worth making a video about at any rate. But to fully flourish, those sparks of novelty will need to be kindled in a new bonfire, far away from the decade of baggage the series seems unable to shake. The good old FromSoft recipe is stagnating, and is in desperate need of a mix-up. I said in that older video that the series was one game away from getting stale. This expansion is that game, and it's well past time to move on to something new. Do I still think Elden Ring is a great game after 2 years of hindsight? Well, yeah, probably. There is a lot to like about the good parts, and I can't bring myself to hate it by any means, but I think as the years go by it will age a lot less gracefully than its Souls predecessors. The open world weighs the game down with a big empty time sink, and it almost certainly shoulders most of the blame for the ridiculous amount of repetition that was necessary to fill it. The visual and thematic variety of bosses is as good as it's ever been, but FromSoft has now crashed face first into the limit of what's reasonable to ask the player to respond to with a combat system lifted from a 10-year-old game. Again, I repeat, it is time for something new. And I think that's enough of an introduction, so it's time to get into the real meat of the video. But on the off chance you haven't played the DLC and you're still on the fence, this is your spoiler warning and your last chance to play it yourself before proceeding. One of the greatest strengths of the Souls games is in the way they force you to take them seriously and act deliberately. When you know that the tiniest mistake can easily result in death, you really do play cautiously and advance carefully when exploring a new area. You're drawn into the fantasy of inhabiting a dangerous world in a very tangible, mechanical way, and I think this may be the single biggest factor in the series' enduring success. I think this is what Miyazaki means when he says in interviews that the point of the series isn't to be difficult just for the sake of it. The point is to pull the player in and have them directly experience how perilous the world is on the mechanical layer of the game, not just on the narrative or visual layer. Put this engrossing system into a complex environment that takes some time and exploration to fully fit together in your head, and you have a solid blueprint for compelling gameplay. A blueprint with an infinite shelf life that will never get old as long as you can keep coming up with interesting new environments. In fact, it can still sort of work even without an interesting environment to accompany it, and it says something about the strength of the exploration in Elden Ring that it can still be somewhat compelling even when it takes place in boring and characterless settings like the catacombs and forges. The falling spike traps, floating cursed eyeballs, and artillery gargoyles provided enough of a navigational challenge to be enjoyable, even if they were visually very dull. But why settle for that compromise when you can have an environment that's both spatially complex and visually stimulating, as the older and more linear games were able to keep up throughout? This is strike one against the open world as far as I'm concerned, because it's the open world that necessitates design shortcuts like this in order to fill it with things to do. Fortunately, the DLC does feature a few areas that are more unique, with the Shadowkeep standing out as the clear highlight. Climbing over these crucified specimens on my way to the loft was among the more memorable parts of navigating the expansion for me. The other fortresses were somewhat less inspiring, but at least Bellurat has multiple pathways going for it, and it felt like a smaller version of Stormvale Castle for that reason. Outside of these castles, keeps and catacombs, most of the player's time will be spent galloping around the overworld, where I have fewer positive things to say. 90% of the space in this overworld is empty, and the other 10% is taken up by bosses from the base game that have been sprinkled around the place for gratuitous rematches. Incidentally, this is strike 2 against the open world in case you're keeping score. This landmass in the northeastern corner demonstrates perfectly what I'm talking about here. It's pretty big, taking up maybe a tenth or so of the total map, so you might be forgiven for thinking that there's a lot here to see and do. Well, there isn't. It's pretty much a straight run to the end for an item related to a side quest, and if you're not doing that side quest, you wasted your time completely. Unless, that is, you were hoping for a chance to fight a boss from the base game for the 4th time. When I saw this crater on the map screen, I took one look at it and said to myself, I bet there's a Falling Star beast there. And guess what? There was. Okay, but surely I'm just cherry picking an example here from a side quest area, right? The rest of the map can't be like this. Well, this is the Cerulean Coast, again about a tenth of the total map size, and in it you can find a demi-human queen who dies in 4 hits, an NPC mausoleum boss barely worthy of the name, a ghost flame dragon, one of at least 6 in the DLC, and the entrance to an actual piece of structured content in the Stone Fissure. I'll spare you a trip through every region of the map because I think you get the thrust of my criticism here. There is a stark difference in quality and player engagement between the barren and hollow overworld and the more purposefully designed interior zones. That strength of the Souls formula I praised a few minutes ago, the way the careful exploration of new areas draws you into the immersive fantasy, completely falls apart in the open world because A, you have no reason to be careful or engage with anything when you can just ride around it on your horsey, and B, in this DLC, it's all stuff you've seen before multiple times in the base game anyway. And that is strike 3. Now, since I'm on the subject, and since I just love complaining about open worlds so much, let me use one more dig on this one as a segue into my next topic. For the most part, I've avoided speaking about the lore in FromSoft games on this channel because it's more or less impenetrable to me as someone who usually only does a single playthrough, and like many, I know I can just watch a video about it later. But that's exactly the point I want to make now, and I think that the open world exacerbates this obtuseness by making so many locations and encounters feel even more abstract and disconnected than they would in a more linear game. Firstly, let me say that I can appreciate the open world value of having landmarks constantly visible in the distance as a way of generating a feeling of continuity. But the same result could have been achieved with a more linear structure as well, perhaps even more effectively. Look no further than the reveal of Irithyll in Dark Souls 3 for evidence of that. But in Elden Ring and its DLC, where practically every overworld location is just sitting in the middle of nowhere surrounded by empty space, or maybe next to a small handful of ruined walls if you're lucky, you'll forgive me for not finding it particularly believable or immersive, and I have to wonder whether this is really an efficient way of structuring and designing a game world. The ancient ruins of Rao, a sort of self-contained overworld region accessible from only one direction, lack the awe-inspiring spectacle of the underground from the base game, and besides the name, they didn't give me the impression of a real space that was once inhabited long ago. And, to be quite honest, I don't care if there's a suitable lore reason for there to be another dancing lion hanging out here. It's still repetition, and it still sucks the fun out of exploring, and it weakens the earlier fight with him by removing its uniqueness. And I mean, what? Has he just been sitting here on top of this pillar for eternity waiting for someone to show up and kill him? I know that death and time might be meaningless concepts in this universe, but he's not even guarding anything. Why is he here? This is what I'm getting at when I said that there's no sense of place or believability, just an abstract and eerie obstacle course with various points of interest, separated by vast empty spaces. When I rode into the shaman's village and heard some sad music kick in, it was a clue that I was supposed to be feeling sad about something, but as far as I could tell this was just 4 little buildings in the middle of nowhere, and I didn't feel any sort of emotion at all. There's a kind of uncanny falseness to it all that I can't quite put my finger on, but the emotionless presentation and interactions with NPCs probably don't help. The majority of NPCs you can come across have something indecipherably cryptic to tell you while standing perfectly still, and then you might simply never see them again if you unwittingly do things in the wrong order to progress their side quest, which is incredibly easy to do in an open world. Every character in the game either gives you some obscure dialogue like this, or immediately wants to kill you, or both in the case of bosses. At this point I've had my fill of walking into a boss's arena and listening to an incomprehensible monologue while they do something weird to one of their body parts. If you want to say that this is my fault and not the game's because I didn't pay enough attention or read enough item descriptions, then I can't really argue with that. And in any case, the game can still be thoroughly enjoyed for the combat and the oppressive atmosphere of the interior regions, so it's never going to be a deal breaker. But I will make a polite suggestion for the team over at FromSoft. Instead of paying shills to make softly spoken lore videos on YouTube, how about just including the actual story in the fucking game? Just a thought. Now, with all of my obligatory open world griping out of the way, let's move on to the bread and butter of the series, combat and boss encounters. First off, a look at leveling and XP, which works mostly the same as in the base game, but with one new development that I think provides an intriguing way forward for FromSoft to innovate on their stagnating formula. For pretty much the entirety of the DLC, I stuck with the same weapon that I settled into using in the base game, Radahn's Greatswords. As a strength build designed around dodging enemy attacks and then responding with a single hit to deal as much punishment as possible, I never came across anything that topped the overwhelming damage and stagger potential of a two-handed jump attack from these bad boys. But even if I had found something promising to draw me away, I would have had to invest tons of resources into upgrading it and making it viable compared to my main choice. And in this way, the upgrading system discourages experimentation with newly discovered weapons. The same goes for Spirit Ashes too, which aren't worth trying out when you already have a plus 10 Mimic tier which can mirror your own damage potential. On top of that, my experience with Spirit Ashes is that the appearance of variety between them all is mostly an illusion, because the truth is that they all bring the same fundamental benefit. They split the boss's attention by giving them another target. I would suggest an alternative upgrading system that upgraded all weapons or Spirit Ashes at once, by an item that permanently increases your weapon proficiency or channeling ability or something like that. This way, instead of encouraging and then punishing investment into a single weapon, as is the case now, players would have a lot more freedom to experiment and could design their builds around movesets rather than stats, which I think is far more interesting. If you think this suggestion goes against the principle of forcing trade-offs in character specialization that makes Souls games work, then consider that that specialization would still take place because of your individual character stats, which can be geared towards strength, dex, magic or whatever else, and can also be reallocated whenever you like anyway. I would also point out that FromSoft already tried something very similar to this in the DLC, with the Shadow Tree fragments that can be found in your explorations around the map, and I think the results are positive. These fragments serve as permanent upgrade items that raise your damage and defense throughout the entire area of the DLC, and the key thing here is that they exist in finite amounts, unlike runes which can be infinitely farmed but are lost upon death with a single chance to retrieve them. This whole using runes or souls as XP thing is another signature feature of FromSoft's that I think is in desperate need of a shake-up after a decade of well-worn use. While I was struggling against and learning my way around the first major boss, I had a fairly large chunk of runes on me that I didn't want to lose, so I kept trying to stay close to the boss door to make it easier to grab my runes on the next try, a distraction which made me play worse than I would have otherwise. When I eventually messed up and lost all my runes by failing to grab them on one attempt, I immediately started playing better without that needless distraction taking up part of my mental bandwidth. Now you might say that this is on me for going into the boss room with a high number of runes that I didn't want to lose. And it's true that I did this because I wrongly assumed that the boss would be a cakewalk. More fool me, right? If I had been less reckless here, I could have teleported away before confronting the boss and farmed more runes, or used consumables to get more until I had enough to bank them by leveling up. But just stop and ask yourself, is it fun when the game encourages you to go and farm enemies? Or is it really boring and tedious? When you approach an imposing boss door for the first time, and your immediate thought isn't one of excitement or dread for the fight you're about to experience, but instead the pencil-pushing question of how you're going to offload all your runes first, something has gone wrong. The fact that you can just teleport to a farming spot somewhere else is part of the problem here, another case of incompatibility between the open world and the 10-year-old formula FromSoft is trying to squeeze into it. Because runes are infinitely farmable, they ultimately don't have any meaningful long-term value to the player. 1,000,000 runes is 1,000,000 runes, whether they came from boss kills, co-op play, consumables, or farming the little blobby fellas underground. This is why I think the limited number of Erdtree fragments in the DLC are a direct improvement over souls or runes when it comes to the question of how to let the player upgrade or level themselves up. The only thing missing to add more depth to this idea is a bit of choice in how the player spends or allocates them, which is something that I hope FromSoft has realised and is planning to experiment with in their next game. All that's left now then is a discussion of the new bosses unique to the DLC, what they say more broadly about the direction FromSoft has been moving in, and what there is to learn from and then innovate on in future games. Starting from the top, I really loved the visual inventiveness of the dancing lion, but its unusual size and shape are probably contributing factors in the lock-on camera being so bad in this fight, especially when it's constantly darting around. If you ever get caught between this boss and a wall, say goodbye to your visibility. This can also be a problem when he, or they, the two puppeteers inside, stand up, and the lock-on point moves up as well and makes it hard to see what's going on. It's such a shame because, as I said, this boss is amazing in terms of visuals, and its moves look cool too, but because the camera is so poor, you can barely see any of it. Thankfully, most bosses have better cameras than this, apart from one that might be even worse that I'll get to later, but this is nevertheless a huge, glaring problem that FromSoft seriously needs to address. Sekiro's camera gets this right by zooming out for fights with larger bosses, and I really don't understand why they failed to carry this over into Elden Ring. Anyway, on a more positive note, Dancing Lion has one move in its repertoire that I thought was very clever, and has a lot of potential to be expanded on in the future. If you get caught in a grab, you take some damage as usual, but you also get a status effect applied, which means that if you take a sip to heal, then the boss gets some health back too. I love this idea. Playing with health as a resource like this is a really interesting concept to me, and I think this particular implementation is more creative than the basic lifesteal on Malenia's attacks from the base game or the vampiric grab performed by the Death Knight in the DLC. In the case of those two bosses, you're obviously already incentivized to avoid their attacks, and so the lifesteal doesn't add any new choices for the player to make, it only adds further punishment for making a mistake. With the Dancing Lion's grab, however, the player has a trade-off to make after getting grabbed. Heal back your damage instantly at the cost of healing the boss too, play defensively until the grab effect wears off and you can heal safely, or accept the risk of being one hit away from death and continue the offensive without healing. It offers a chance to make a calculated decision that might change based on the player's familiarity with the boss, or how much health the boss has left, or any number of other circumstances. Of course, the best strategy is simply to not get grabbed, so this move doesn't rock the boat too much and it still plays by the traditional rules of Souls combat laid down 10 years ago. But perhaps you can see why I think there's room for a lot more experimentation with this idea of linking the player and the boss's health pools, and I hope to see FromSoft running with it in the future. I found R'Larna to be quite an enjoyable boss, and I liked the way her various projectile moves could link up in terms of timing when cast in sequence. Her combos can have a lot of moves in them, but they're executed fairly quickly, and I rarely found myself waiting for too long between chances to attack. I could be wrong about this, but as far as I could tell, her double full moon attack is something she only does once near the end of the fight, and I like this idea of a signature move that the boss only deploys once. It gives the move some importance and turns it into a real landmark of the fight that feels good to clear after learning how to deal with it. If Malenia's waterfowl dance had been a single-use move like this, it would have been much fairer and wouldn't have received nearly the amount of controversy that it did. Another lesson to keep in mind for the future, I think. Romina, Saint of the Bud, gave me hardly any trouble at all, and went down on the third try. I think this was due to a combination of the fact that her attacks are fairly straightforward and readable, which you may or may not think is a good thing, and that when I was crouched after a jump attack, her swipes would go over my hitbox and leave me unscathed, which again, you may or may not think is a good thing. Either way, I wish this boss had given me a little more to bite into, but the occasional easier boss is no big deal. She definitely looks cool anyway. I love the pink wings and the whole insect combo thing. I thought the golden hippopotamus was mostly enjoyable when it wasn't giving me camera trouble for getting into melee range. His combos hit hard, but are really short, so there are plenty of opportunities for getting in damage once you're comfortable dodging them. Although his charging grab is bullshit and will catch you when it really doesn't feel fair. This is a multi-phase boss done well. The moves he gains at the halfway point complement his others pretty well, and it really feels like you're fighting a beast that's completely out of control. Commander Gaius, Elden Ring's answer to Oniwa Gyobu, is a boss that I feel less generously towards. This one honestly kind of sucked. In my video on Elden Ring, I mentioned that no enemy in the game can match your agility or speed while on a horse, which made mounted combat too easy. Gaius is FromSoft's oppressive answer to that complaint, and the only evidence you could ever need to prove that Torrent should have had some iframes on its dodge. The concept of a joust or a rider versus rider showdown is a compelling one that felt missing from the base game, but the fight against Gaius will see you spending almost all of it running away from him because you have no other options for responding to his attacks, especially his forward charge. When it comes to Messmer, unfortunately I don't have a lot to say. He was another boss that felt a bit easier than it was supposed to. I beat his second phase the first time I saw it, although it did still make for an impressive spectacle. He does have some gratuitously long combos in phase 2 that leave you with nothing to do but dodge and wait, but since I beat him so quickly I didn't get annoyed by them. For what it's worth, I thought it was okay. Bonus points for having a memeable line of dialogue when he kills you.
In the embrace of Messmer's flame.
Midra likewise was enjoyable, but without a whole lot of unique things to say about him, although he does offer a good example of a trend I noticed in some bosses. A few too many of them have these ridiculously huge AoE burst attacks where the only way to avoid damage is to just run really far away. Like I said with Rolana, if moves like this were deployed once per fight, I wouldn't mind too much, but I'd rather not have to do it multiple times because honestly it's kind of tedious. I have to wonder if the rationale behind these moves is to catch out Spirit Ash summons, who don't have the good sense to move out of the way, or other summoned players, who don't have the good sense to move out of the way. The Erdtree avatar has an area attack like this, which also happens to be a great example of how hit trading can be a dominant and boring strategy. I like the whole 3-phase marathon that makes this fight into a test of endurance, but the third phase in particular has one of those huge area attacks with a very lengthy recovery time afterwards. More than long enough to give you time to eat the damage, heal it all back, and then get in a few free hits on its weak spot while it recovers. And yes, I know that earlier I praised the idea of letting the player toy with health as a resource like this, but I hope too much explanation isn't needed on why this is a very basic and boring expression of the concept, with no risk and all reward. Before I move on to the final couple of bosses, a quick word on dragons. There are just way too damn many, and they're all the same. It's remarkable that FromSoft made exactly the same mistake in the DLC as they did in the base game. In fairness, some of them are spiced up a little bit, like the one where 2 dragons are fighting each other, or the one that has an army trying to slay it. But in both of these cases, the NPCs do barely any damage to each other, and you will eventually just end up in an ordinary dragon fight once it comes down to you and a single Scalyboy. If they did more damage, then the player might have had a bit more freedom to play them off each other, and these fights may have felt less repetitive. I enjoyed my first encounter with a dragon in the DLC because it had been 2 years since I last played the game and I was more or less relearning it. But when I came across my second, third, fourth and fifth, my opinion started to sour and I remembered why I got tired of seeing them in the base game. This overuse of dragons is without a doubt the biggest piss take in terms of the DLC reusing base game content, but there are also too many tree spirits. And did there really need to be 2 extra bears? If I wanted to fight the same bosses I did 2 years ago, then I could have just replayed the base game for free. Alright, moving on to the endgame. For the majority of my time with the DLC, I managed to stick to my usual preference of soloing every boss and enjoying the pleasant struggle of learning how to deal with each of their moves and when to land an attack of my own. Until, that is, I reached Baal and then the final boss Radahn, both of which stopped being a pleasant struggle after a few hours of beating my head against them, for similar but slightly different reasons. In the case of Baal, this was because the camera is just abysmal in his fight. He only has a single lock-on point, and it's on his head, which moves around way too much to be a reliable target, especially for a strength build that by design has very few windows for attacking to begin with. On top of that, if you dodge to the side and then try attacking, his wing will often get in the way and you won't be able to see his head at all. The lock-on works against you in the worst possible way in this fight, but if you don't use it, then you're stuck babysitting the camera on a boss that's liable to dash around out of sight. If you're not locked on when he flies up into the air, you are completely fucked. All that was needed to fix this problem, besides the usual need for the camera to be zoomed out a bit, was an alternative lock-on point on his body or legs that the player could switch to when his head isn't a viable target. What's truly maddening about this is that every other dragon, of which there are many, already solved this problem. I don't understand how FromSoft got this so wrong, but after trying this boss for over 2 hours and realising that I wasn't having fun, I summoned the NPC in the arena and beat him straight away. And that leads me finally to the ultimate boss of the DLC, Radahn, Consort of Miquella, a grueling spectacle that stretches the limits of FromSoft's aging combat mechanics well past their breaking point, and leaves me more certain than ever that this formula has been squeezed for everything it's worth, and has nowhere left to go without a major overhaul. Radahn's combos are long. You might have to avoid 5 or 6 attacks before getting a chance to reply with a hit of your own, and then, depending on his previous move, he might already be winding up a new attack that you won't have time to dodge. The short time between his attacks is sometimes so short that you can't get a hit in unless you want to eat some damage in return, and this is all assuming, of course, that he doesn't just jump out of the arena entirely and leave you waiting until he feels like coming back down. Radahn sometimes ends a combo early, or extends it depending on your perspective from whichever version you see first. But what this means is that you can't reliably punish him when one of these attacks ends, because you don't know if there's another hit coming. I wouldn't mind this if the combo could branch into different finishing moves, and in fact that might be quite enjoyable to react to, but when there's a chance that the final move just might not happen at all, you're forced to hesitate before responding, which again means that you might not have enough time to pull off a full attack before he comes at you with another move. Now buckle up, because I'm barely halfway done. I spent 5 hours over multiple play sessions taking on this boss, so believe it or not, I have a lot to say about him. I'm not a big fan of his gravity pull move, which damages you via a follow-up attack that only triggers if you fail to dodge the pull. This means that you're locked into damage a few seconds after you made your mistake, with nothing you can do to avoid it short of rolling to take slightly less of a hit when the spikes eventually come out. Functionally, this move is very similar to a grab in the way it delays damage until a little while after your mistake, but I find something fundamentally unsatisfying about this one. At least grabs are more honest by just taking away control until the boss has had their fun. It wouldn't be so bad if this pull wasn't extra hard to respond to, because 1. It requires an extremely quick reaction to dodge successfully almost as soon as you see the burst of purple, and 2. This purple telegraph is more or less identical to the one for a different gap closing move that requires completely different timing to avoid. And I haven't even started on Phase 2 yet. While many of the moves I've mentioned from Phase 1 are annoying and tedious to deal with, it is at least possible to get somewhat consistent with it and reach the midway point with the majority of your healing flasks intact. The second phase, not so much, and it's here that the difficulty really gets catapulted into the stratosphere in a way that I hope FromSoft can see is completely unsustainable. The moves that he carries over from Phase 1 gain these holy follow-up flashes, which are an interesting idea that I don't object to in theory. They mean that you have to consider the direction of your roll in addition to its timing, to make sure that you don't end up rolling straight into the follow-up beam, which is tough but not unreasonable in a final boss. But the way they're implemented here, combined with the stupidly long combos of this boss, it's just way too much, and it doesn't help that these sparkly moves also frequently cause the frame rate to tank, or just obscure the boss to prevent you from reading him. I'm pretty sure one of the spectral moves he does in this phase sends a spirit towards every player in the arena, which suggests to me that this boss was never intended to be fought alone. And I mean, even with summons, he's no pushover. If you did beat this boss by yourself, then fair play to you. You're a more patient player than I am. In the end, I settled on summoning a Mimic tier at the halfway point to divide the boss's attention in Phase 2, and there's no question that in my final successful attempt, it saved me from death multiple times by doing so. All of this is to say that Radahn is a very difficult boss, but he's not difficult in a way that's fun, or engaging, or interesting, or that gives you multiple options for dealing with him. He's difficult because you have to avoid a constant barrage of attacks to get one opportunity to hit him, and if you make a single mistake and you need to use that opportunity to heal instead, then you have nothing to show for the last 30 seconds of dodging. This is the end of the road for boss difficulty within the boundaries of the current stamina-based combat system. There is absolutely no way to take it any further than this. The formula has been bled dry, and now the only way to prevent stagnation is to burn the desiccated corpse of this series and start fresh with something new. Please, FromSoft, I'm begging you, move on, do something new, the fans will follow you. So, final thoughts on Elden Ring and its DLC. My negative opinion on the open world hasn't changed from 2 years ago. It succeeds in making the game's runtime longer, and not much else. In fact, with the freedom that it gives the player to miss or deliberately ignore potentially interesting encounters by going around them, you could, and I would, make the argument that the open world tramples over the core fantasy of the series, that you're alone in an overwhelmingly hostile world and have to come to terms with it to proceed. When you only ever engage with an enemy, boss, or dangerous area on your own terms, that foreboding fantasy is ripped away from you, and instead of feeling like you're struggling to survive whatever the world throws at you, you're just churning through content in a checklist. This is doubly true because of the ridiculous amount of repetition that's necessary in order to populate the map with things to do and justify its size. But, since you never quite know when they're gonna pull a fast one on you and hide some unique or major content behind one of these copy-pasted locations, you have to complete them all, just in case. 9 times out of 10 there was nothing new to see, but at that point it doesn't matter. The devs have already tricked you into playing 2 hours worth of game 5 times over, for a grand total of 10 repetitive hours played. That is open world game design in a nutshell. When it comes to leveling and player progression, I like the direction that the DLC took with the Shadow Tree fragments coming as rewards for exploration. As they can only be found in limited numbers, there's no chance of infinitely farming them, so each individual one actually means something to the player, and I think this is something that's been missing from the souls or runes as XP system that's been the default in the series up until now. A bit of choice in how to allocate or reallocate these upgrade items would add a lot of depth here too. The player shouldn't be motivated to explore, fight enemies and take on bosses by the XP or reward they get at the end. They should be motivated by the experience itself being an interesting or otherwise engaging one. This is what separates a game that's worth investing your time into from a mindless lottery machine designed only to waste it. I'm not playing the game to watch a number in the corner go up. I'm playing the game to be surprised and intrigued and challenged by what it presents me with. The most effective motivator to beating any boss is when you know that the remainder of the game is waiting behind them. That's not to say there can't be optional bosses along the way, of course, perhaps with a genuinely unique weapon or ability as your reward for beating them, but for the love of Mikola, don't use that as an excuse to copy and paste the same boss multiple times. Which reminds me, if you're gonna include hundreds of different weapons in your game, don't encourage the player to heavily invest in a single one and then punish them with resource farming for daring to experiment with new ones. As for the direction FromSoft has taken with the boss fights, I've more or less said my piece on that already. The jig is up now, and the limit has been reached of what's possible within the combat system the series has been coasting on since its inception. Fresh ideas like the flask vampirism of the Dancing Lion are an intriguing start, but those seeds need to be planted in a whole new garden to bear worthwhile fruit. I'm talking a whole new combat system that's not based around stamina. Maybe something that rewards dodging by building up your attack power, or lets you stack hits on an enemy and then cash them all in at once for multiplied damage. I won't claim these are groundbreaking ideas. I'm not an industry-leading game designer, but the sky's the limit here, and with Elden Ring, FromSoft has been content splashing around in a 10-year-old puddle. This is an area where Sekiro succeeded beautifully at creating something original by replacing stamina with posture, a resource that works completely differently. And crucially, it made the enemies and bosses play by the same rules as the player, masterfully encouraging an aggressive and exciting playstyle. I have faith that FromSoft has the talent to do something like that again, but after the record-setting success of Elden Ring, it remains to be seen if they have the will. As I'm wrapping things up like this, it occurs to me that this video will be something of a eulogy for Elden Ring, as I can't see myself picking it up again in the future. I can only hope that it's not also a eulogy for my passion for FromSoft's games. If the next project they announce is Elden Ring 2, they're dead to me, and right now I'm not sure if I would be able to muster the enthusiasm to go through all this again. The team at FromSoft now stands at a crossroads, with the fate of one of the best loved and most respected developers in the industry hanging in the balance. Kindly Miyazaki holds our hearts in his hands, and only he can know which way the pendulum will swing.